The rain-slicked city. The city never slept, but it never truly woke either. It was a place of shadows and silence, where the neon lights flickered like the last breath of a dying man. Rain fell in sheets, turning the streets into rivers of filth and ruin, and the air was thick with the stench of damp concrete and unwashed bodies. The city had seen its share of vice, of crime, of men who had lost their way, and women who had lost their way, and women who had lost everything. And in the middle of it all, standing in the doorway of a rundown hotel, was Sam Verrill, a man who had long since stopped believing in justice. Verrill was a detective, but not the kind you found in the newspapers. He didn't wear a badge, didn't carry a gun unless it was absolutely necessary, and he didn't trust anyone, not even himself. His face was a map of old wounds, his eyes the color of a storm about to break. He had seen too much, too many men broken and women ruined, and he had learned that the world was not meant to be saved. It was meant to be endured. He stepped into the rain, his trench coat soaked through, his boots squelching with every step. The city was his domain, and he moved through it like a ghost, unseen and unshaken. He had no illusions about the life he lived, no delusions of grandeur. He was a man who dealt in facts, in cold, hard truth, and he had long since given up on anything that resembled hope. The city was a place of secrets, and Verrill had spent his life uncovering them. He had walked the same streets, the same alleys, the same bars, and had seen the same faces, the same crimes, the same people who had long since stopped caring about anything but their own survival. He had no friends, no family, no ties that bound him to anything beyond the work he did. And yet, he did it anyway. He had to. Because if he didn't, who would? The rain was falling harder now, and the city was watching, waiting, because somewhere in its depths a mystery was waiting to be uncovered, and Sam Verrill was the only man who could do it, a client in distress. The rain had soaked through the fabric of the coat Verrill had borrowed from a sympathetic bartender, and as he stepped into the dimly lit room, he found himself face to face with a woman who looked as though she had walked through the same storm that had drenched the city. She was in her late 30s, her face lined with worry and sleepless nights. Her eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to search for something in him that he wasn't sure he had to offer. "I need your help," she said, her voice trembling. She sat on the edge of the worn-out chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "My husband! He disappeared 3 days ago! I've been searching for him ever since!" Verrill leaned against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest. He had heard that line before, more times than he cared to remember. People always came to him with stories of missing loved ones, of betrayal, of secrets buried, too deep to unearth. But there was something different about this woman. She wasn't begging for help, she was demanding it. "What's his name?" Verrill asked, his voice low and steady. "Eli Grayson," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was a journalist. He wrote for the Star-Ledger before he left. He said he wanted to get out of the city, to start over. But he never made it." Verrill's eyes narrowed. A journalist disappearing, there was always a reason. Whether it was a leak, a threat, or something more personal, he had seen it all before. But this case felt different. The woman's desperation was palpable, and for the first time in a long while, Verrill felt the faintest stir of demanding. "What's his name and out of the city? To start over." "But he never made it." Verrill asked narrowed. A journalist disappearing. There was always a reason. Whether it was a leak, a threat, or something more personal, he had seen it all before. But this case felt different. The woman's desperation was puting was awe. "Place he was seen?" he asked, his tone clipped. She hesitated for a moment, as if weighing the weight of her words. "He was last seen at the Black Cat, a bar on 17th Street. He left in a hurry, said something about a tip that was too big to ignore. I tried to follow him, but he was gone by the time I got there." Verrill's mind was already working, piecing together the fragments of the case before it even began. The Black Cat was a place that had seen its share of trouble. It was a bar for men who dealt in secrets, for those who had nothing left to lose. If Eli Grayson had been there, then there was a reason had been there. Then there was a reason. And Verrill had a feeling that this call than he had anticipated. The Black Cat. The Black Cat was a relic of the city's past, a place where the air was thick with the scent of cheap whiskey and the remnants of old sins. The bar was tucked between two buildings that had long since stopped pretending to be anything but ruins, their windows shattered and their facades peeling like the skin of a dead man. Inside, the dim glow of a single bulb overhead cast long shadows over the worn wooden floor, where men with tired eyes and heavier hearts sat in silence, nursing drinks that had long since lost their warmth. Verrill stepped inside, his boots making a soft squelch against the floor, and the bartender, a wiry man with a face like a dried-up riverbed, looked up from the bottle he was wiping. He didn't say a word, just gave Verrill a look that was equal parts warning and curiosity. Verrill didn't waste time with pleasantries. He approached the bar, his voice low but firm. "I need information," he said. "A man named Eli Grayson was here 3 days ago. I need to know what he was doing." The bartender didn't move, didn't even blink. He simply took a slow sip from the glass of whiskey in front of him and set it down with deliberate care. "You don't want to know," he said finally. Verrill's jaw tightened. He had heard that line before, but he had never let it stop him. "I don't have time for riddles," he said. "Either you tell me what you know, or I find someone else who will." The bartender exhaled, a long, slow sound that seemed to stretch the silence in the bar. He leaned back against the counter, his eyes never leaving Verrill. "Eli didn't come here for drinks," he said at last. "He came looking for something that wasn't here anymore." Verrill frowned. "What kind of something?" The bartender didn't answer immediately. He reached under the bar, pulled out a small, worn-out envelope, and slid it across the counter. Verrill picked it up, his fingers brushing against the paper. It was old, the edges frayed, and the seal was broken. Inside was a single piece of paper, a name scrawled in hurried handwriting, Marcus Hale. Verrill's pulse quickened. He had heard that name before, though not in the context of a missing journalist. Marcus Hale was a man who had long since disappeared from the city's records, a name that had been buried along with the secrets he had once been known for. He looked back at the bartender, but the man was already turning away, his back to Verrill as if he had never spoken at all. Verrill stood there for a moment, the weight of the name pressing down on him, before he stepped back out into the rain. The city had a way of keeping its secrets, but Verrill had never been one to let them remain buried. The informant's warning. The rain had not let up, and as Verrill made his way through the city's labyrinth of alleys and back streets, his mind was already racing with the implications of the name Marcus Hale. He had heard the name before, but never in connection to a missing journalist. Hale had a way of keeping its secrets, but Verrill had never been one to let them remain buried. The Verrill had never been one to let them remain buried. Been a man who had walked the same streets Verrill had, a man who had known the city's underbelly as well as anyone. He had been a fixer, a man who had dealt in information, in secrets, in the kind of things that were never meant to be spoken aloud. And now, that name had resurfaced, tied to Eli Grayson's disappearance. Verrill knew that if he was going to find the truth, he would need someone who knew what Hale had been up to. He had a contact, a man who had once worked for Hale before he had disappeared from the city's records. The man's name was Jack Marlowe, and he had a reputation for knowing things that others preferred to forget. Verrill found him in a dingy apartment above a pawn shop on 14th Street, where the air was thick with the scent of mildew and old whiskey. Marlowe was a thin, wiry man with a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He sat on the edge of a broken-down couch, a cigarette dangling from his lips as he watched Verrill step inside. He didn't say a word, didn't even move as Verrill approached. He simply exhaled a plume of smoke and looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. "You're asking about Hale?" Marlowe said at last, his voice rough like sandpaper. "You're not the first one to come looking for him, but you might be the last." Verrill didn't flinch. He had heard that kind of warning before, and he had learned long ago that it was never a good sign. "What do you know?" he asked. Marlowe took a long drag from his cigarette before exhaling slowly. "Hale wasn't just a fixer," he said. "He was something else. A man who had a way of finding things that others wanted to keep hidden. He had a network of informants, people who owed him favors, people who were afraid of him." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "And he had a particular interest in journalists." Verrill's fingers curled into a fist. "What does that mean?" Marlowe leaned back, his expression unreadable. "It means that if Eli Grayson was looking for something, it was something that Hale had either buried or was afraid of." He took another drag from his cigarette before setting it down with a slow, deliberate motion. "And if you're going after Hale, you're going to have to be careful. He doesn't take kindly to people poking around in his business." Verrill studied him for a moment, then nodded. He had already expected as much. He had known that this case was going to be dangerous, that it would bring him face to face with the kind of people who didn't like to be questioned. But he had also known that he would never back down from a mystery that had been buried for too long. He turned to leave, but before he could step out into the rain, Marlowe called out to him. "You're not the only one looking for Hale," he said. "There are others, and they're not as patient as you are." Verrill didn't respond. He simply walked out into the rain, the weight of the warning pressing down on him like a stone. He had always known that the city was full of secrets, but now he was beginning to understand just how deep some of them ran. The hunt begins. The rain had turned the city into a labyrinth of slick streets and broken glass, and Verrill moved through it like a man who had long since learned to survive in its depths. He had no illusions about the dangers that lay ahead. Hale was a man who had built his empire on fear, and if Verrill was going to find the truth, he would have to tread carefully. But he had also learned that the only way to survive in this city was to never stop moving. His first lead had been a name, Marcus Hale, but names were rarely enough. He needed more than that, and he knew that if he wanted to find Hale, he would have to find the people who had once worked for him. The informants, the fixers, the men who had once owed him favors. But he also knew that those people were not likely to be eager to speak. Hale had a way of making people disappear if they didn't do what he wanted. Verrill's first stop was a small club on the outskirts of the city, a place where the city's more dangerous men gathered. He had heard that one of Hale's old contacts still worked there, a man named Frank Delaney. Delaney had once been a lawyer, but he had long since abandoned that life for one that was far more profitable. Verrill found him at the bar, nursing a drink with the kind of expression that said he had seen too much to ever be surprised by anything. "You're looking for Hale," Delaney said without even looking up from his glass. Verrill didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need to know where he is." Delaney exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing. You don't want to know, he said. Hale isn't someone you want to cross. He's not just a man who deals in secrets, he's a man who deals in death. Verrill leaned in, his voice low. I don't care about the risks. I need to find him. Delaney studied him for a moment, then finally studied him for a moment, then finally set his glass down. If you're going to find him, you'll have to go to the docks. He's been keeping a low profile, but I heard he's been meeting with someone there. Verrill didn't waste in deals. She? He disappeared. Verrill's jaw tightened. He had heard the name before, but not in the context of a missing journalist. Rourke was a man who had once been a part of Hale's operation, but he had vanished years ago. If he was back in the city, then he might have the answers Verrill needed. He left the club and made his way through the city, his mind already working through the possibilities. If Rourke was still in the city, then he might be the only one who could lead him to Hale. But he also knew that Rourke was not a man who was likely to be easy to find. As he approached the docks, the rain had begun to fall harder, and the air was thick with the scent of salt and decay. He moved carefully, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. He had always known that this case would be dangerous, but he had also known that he had no choice. He had to find the truth, no matter the cost, and as he stepped into the darkness of the docks, he knew that the real hunt had just begun. The man behind the shadows. Verrill's search led him to a name that had long since faded from the city's records. Rourke. He was a ghost, a man who had once been part of Hale's operation before vanishing into the depths of the city's underbelly. But now, he was back, and Verrill had no doubt that he held the key to the mystery that had brought him here. The docks were a place of decay and forgotten things, where the city's secrets were buried beneath the weight of time and neglect. Verrill moved through the shadows, his eyes scanning the darkened warehouses and the rusted cranes that loomed over the water like skeletal fingers. He had expected Rourke to be difficult to find, but he had not anticipated the sheer number of men who were watching him. He had barely taken 2 steps before the first man appeared, a hulking figure who stepped out from the shadows with a slow, deliberate motion. Verrill didn't move, didn't even blink. He had seen men like this before, enforcers, men who did the bidding of others without ever asking questions. He knew that if he showed any sign of fear, they would take it as weakness. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a cigarette, lighting it with the hulking warehouses, with the rusted cranes that loomed over the water like skeletal fine. Verrill didn't move, didn't even blink. He had seen men like this before, enforcers, men who did the bidding of others without ever asking. Slow, measured motion. He took a long drag before exhaling the smoke into the night air. I need to talk to Rourke, he said, his voice calm even. And I don't think you're going to stop me. The man didn't move, didn't even blink. He simply watched Verrill with eyes that had seen too much. Then, without a word, he turned and disappeared into the shadows. Verrill waited for a moment, then stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He had always known that this case would be dangerous, but he had also known that this case would be dangerous, but he had also known that he would never back down from a mystery that had been buried for too long. He found Rourke in a small, dimly lit room inside one of the warehouses, the air thick with the scent of old wood and damp earth. He said, a voice pounding in his chest. He had always known that this case would be dangerous, and I'd always known that this case would be dangerous, but he'd also known that he would never back down from a mystery that had been like in it. Rourke was older than Verrill had expected, his face lined with the weight of years and secrets. He sat at a table, his hands wrapped around a glass of whiskey, his eyes watching Verrill with the kind of expression that said he had seen too many men come and go. You're not the first one to come looking for me, Rourke said at last, his voice rough like sandpaper. But you might be the last. Verrill didn't flinch. He had heard that kind of warning before. I need to know where Hale is, he said. And I need to know where Hale is, he said. And I need to know why Eli Grayson disappeared. Rourke studied him for a moment, then finally set his glass down. Hale is a man who doesn't take kindly to people who ask too many questions, he said. But if you want to know the truth, you'll have to be willing to listen. Verrill leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. What do you know? Rourke exhaled slowly, then finally spoke. Eli Grayson was looking for something that Hale had hidden. He had a file, a set of documents that contained information that could have brought Hale down. He had been working on it for years, but he never had the chance to finish it. Verrill's pulse quickened. What kind of information? Rourke's eyes darkened. It was about the city's most powerful men, the ones who had been keeping their secrets for far too long. Hale didn't want that information to come out. He had a way of making sure that people like Grayson disappeared. Verrill's jaw tightened. He had been working on it for years, but he never had the chance to finish it. Verrill's pulse quickened. What kind of information? Rourke's eyes darkened. What kind of information? Rourke's eyes darkened. It was about the city's most powerful men, the ones who had been keeping their secrets for far too long. He understood just how far he was willing to go. He had buried men who had threatened his power, had made sure that no one ever came close to uncovering the truth. And now, he had a journalist who had come too close. Verrill knew that the time for hesitation was over. If he was going to find the truth, he would have to face Hale head on. The confrontation. The night was thick with the scent of rain and salt, the air heavy with the weight of the city's secrets. Verrill moved through the shadows, his steps silent against the damp ground as he approached the warehouse where Hale was waiting. He had no illusions about what was coming. This was not a meeting, not a negotiation. This was a reckoning. He had spent the last few days piecing together the truth, following the trail that had led him to Hale, and now he was standing on the threshold of the final confrontation. Hale was a man who had built his empire on fear, and he had never been one to let anyone stand in his way. But Verrill had faced men like Hale before, and he had always come out on top. The warehouse was dark, its windows shattered, its interior filled with the remnants of a life long since abandoned. Verrill stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. He had expected a trap, and he had no doubt that Hale had been waiting for him. Then he saw him. Hale stood near the center of the room, his back to Ver, his hands resting on the edge of a table, as if he had been waiting for this moment. He was older than Verrill had expected, his face lined with the weight of years and secrets, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. "You've been digging where you shouldn't have," Hale said without turning. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a warning that Verrill had heard before. Verrill stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. "You know what you did to Eli Grayson," he said. "You had him killed because he found out the truth." Hale finally turned, his expression unreadable. "Grayson was a fool," he said. "He thought he could expose me, that he could bring me down, but he didn't understand the game he was playing." Verrill's jaw tightened. "You don't get to decide who lives and who." "Eli Grayson," he said. "You had him killed because he found out the truth." Hale finally turned. He said thickly, "Dies." Hale's lips curled into a slow, deliberate smile. "That's not how the world works, Verrill. Power is everything, and I have more of it than you ever will." Verrill didn't move, didn't flinch. He had always known that this was the kind of man Hale was, a man who believed that the world was meant to be ruled by those who had the strength to do it. But he had also known that strength was not the only thing that mattered. He had always believed in the truth, in the power of knowing what was right, and what was right, and what was right, and what was wrong. And now he had the chance to make Hale see that. He stepped forward, his hand moving to his coat, where he had concealed his gun. "You're going to pay for what you did," he said. "For every man you sent to the grave, for every secret you buried." Hale's smile didn't falter. "You think you can stop me?" Verrill didn't answer. He didn't need to. He moved. The shot rang out, and the room exploded into chaos. The city remains. The rain had not stopped, and as Verrill stepped out into the night, the city stretched before him in all its weary, unchanging glory. The neon lights flickered like the last breath of a dying man, casting long shadows over the streets that had seen too much. He had done what he had set out to do, uncovered the truth, brought Hale to justice, and ensured that Eli Grayson's name would not be forgotten. But as he stood there, the weight of everything he had done pressed down on him, heavier than it had ever been before. He had always known that the city was a place of secrets, of men and women who had long since stopped caring about anything but their own survival. He had walked these streets for years, had seen the same faces, the same crimes, the same people who had been broken by the world. And yet, no matter how many times he had done it, no matter how many times he had faced down men like Hale, the city had never changed. It had never stopped being a place of vice, of corruption, of men who had long since given up on justice. He had always told himself that he didn't care about the world, that he had no illusions about the life he lived, that he had no friends, no family, no ties that bound him to anything beyond the work he did. And yet, even now, as he stood in the rain, he felt the faintest stir of something that had once been called hope. He had done what he had set out to do, but he had also seen the cost. He had seen the faces of the people who had been left behind, the ones who had been forgotten by the world. He had always believed that the only way to survive in this city was to never stop moving, to never let the world catch up to you. But he had also known that there were times when even the strongest men had to stop and look back. And now, as he turned away from the warehouse, as he stepped back into the rain, he knew that there would always be more cases, more secrets, more men like Hale who thought they could control the world. But he would be there waiting, because if he wasn't, who would be? The city would never change, but neither would he. The final piece Verrill stood on the edge of the dock, the rain still falling in relentless sheets, the city behind him a place of shadows and secrets. He had done what he had set out to do. He had found the truth, had brought Hale to justice, and had ensured that Eli Grayson's name would not be forgotten. But as he looked out over the dark waters, he knew that the city would never change. It would never stop being a place of vice, of corruption, of men who had long since given up on justice. He had always told himself that he didn't care about the world, that he had no illusions about the life he lived, that he had no friends, no family, no ties that bound him to anything beyond the work he did. And yet, even now, as he stood there, he felt the faintest stir of something that had once been called hope. He had done what he had set out to do, but he had also seen the cost. He had seen the faces of the people who had been left behind, the ones who had been forgotten by the world. He had always believed that the only way to survive in this city was to never stop moving, to never let the world catch up to you. But he had also known that there were times when even the strongest man had to stop and look back. And now, as he turned away from the warehouse, as he stepped back into the rain, he knew that there would always be more cases, more secrets, more men like Hale who thought they could control the world. But he would be there, waiting, because if he wasn't, who would be? He had always been a man who dealt in facts, in cold, hard truth. And now, as he turned away from the city, he knew that he would never stop, because if he did, the world would never change. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories. Hit the notification bell to be notified of new stories when they become available. Feel free to leave a comment and tell me if you enjoyed the story and want to hear more like it.